because I still want the key light to be this back opening in the cave. It's looking a little better. Yeah, I'm liking that a bit better. And let's just check also, because of the fill light, just want to check this area since it's kind of key. So the center sphere fill light should be illuminating this a little bit. Oh, and you can see here where it is. We'll want to turn that off. So it also looks like I need to brighten it up. I shouldn't have lowered it. So if we come here with the light, we can turn on invisible, so we won't get this bright white light here. And let me increase this back up to like 12. Just do a quick render again. Okay, there you can see we're getting some nice kind of fill light there. Let's maybe even increase this 14. I'm going to drop this one down just a little bit. Maybe 1.2. Save this out. And this light is still visible. I'm kind of just leaving it on just so I can see the white. For the final render, I was turning this off to be invisible, and then that was in alpha that we were then in post replacing with a kind of cave waterfall footage. For now, I'm just leaving it white just because it's a good stand-in just for that, what'll be there later. Let me go back to my render setup, and I'm going to increase these back to what they were. Set this back to view. We'll do a render of the whole shot here. See how it's looking. So I won't be going over any of what I did to make the textures. I'll just be including these pre-made textures that you'll be able to use on this project. But you can see the textures are adding a bit to what we did in Zbrush. You can also try, if you have any rock textures that you use, or finding some online and testing them out to get different looks to these rocks. You can experiment with that. Now we're getting a few kind of blown out areas here, and it's looking a little bright, so I may turn down this back key light a bit. Or I may actually darken the ground as well, just to kind of compensate. So let me cancel that really quick. So let me just lower this. Actually, I may, instead of lowering that, this is kind of where it gets tricky when you're lighting. You kind of have to determine whether you want to change the lights or the materials to get the effect, the final effect you're looking for. In this case, I'm going to try changing the materials to get more of an effect, since I have a little more control here in the materials. I'm going to decrease the spec a little bit so to remove some of those blown out areas. So here in this node that I'm darkening for the spec, if I decrease this brightness to say 45, you'll see this spec pretty much disappear. So let me bring that back a little bit, maybe go to 43. Yeah, stick with 43. Change it on the back wall as well. Now if we come in here, just grab a region here. We should see these these white areas get a little darker while still retaining the look of the rest of the scene. Yeah, so now they're not quite white. You generally don't want pure whites or pure blacks in your scene. I may even increase this fill light just so I'm not getting so many blacks. Maybe even move this back so it's affecting more of this back wall. Let's take a look at this back wall. So a lot of this is just, you know, tweaking numbers, again, deciding whether you want to change a light or change a material. There we're picking up a bit more detail there. It's looking better. Maybe decrease this light a bit. Okay, come back here. Now, as far as indirect illumination, if you want to play around with this, it does add a bit to your render time, but you can just go ahead and turn this on. I like to use an irradiance map, and then for the secondary bounces, the light cache. And I'll change these usually to like 0.9, 0.8 for secondary, just so that there is some fall off. And then under the irradiance map, changing this to like a medium to preview. Just save again. And now if we go back here to our render, it's going to do a quick calculation of the lighting. It's going to build the secondary bounce light cache. And we'll be getting a lot more light, so if you do go this route, you may need to, again, readjust your lights and bring them down in intensity a bit. Since now we're getting additional light bouncing off the floor and the walls and all the rocks. So depending on how I light, whether I go with GI or not, really depends on the shot. And also the time, you know, render time will really factor into things. So generally, if I can get a faster effect without it, I won't use it. Also depending, sometimes I'll bake a GI in, or if nothing's moving in the scene, you can just calculate the GI for the first frame or the first and last frame and not have to calculate it for every single frame. So you can see we're just getting some nice bounce light fill in some of these areas. It's making the scene a bit more realistic. It's also softening up some of the lighting. It's not quite so harsh. So I'm just gonna let this go. And again, this isn't a very long shot that we used in the White Storm project. So I was able to use this very high geo, and even though the render times were a little longer than some of our other shots, since it was maybe only, I don't know, 100 to 200 frames long, it wasn't that bad to render. So this is looking really good. There's still a few hot spots. I would maybe go in and adjust a little bit, or maybe even adjust the texture in these areas to be darker or have less spec. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes, again, you can't sculpt the light exactly how you want. So sometimes I'll go into Photoshop and paint directly on the textures in these areas to darken them to remove some of the hot spots I'm getting. But this is looking pretty nice. So there's a few couple things I want to go over here before I finish. Back in with the render settings. There's I'm going to show off some of the final settings I use. So I'm going to turn this back up to 1024, which will be our final resolution. One additional thing that may have been affecting this, under global switches here in Vray, you want to make sure to turn off hidden lights. We didn't have any hidden lights, so it shouldn't affect our renders at all. But if you ever have lights that say here in the layers are on a separate layer that's turned off, Vray will still actually calculate them unless you uncheck this box. So you want to make sure that hidden lights is unchecked. And now for some final settings, I'll change my anti-aliasing filter to 3, my min to 2, and my max to 24. This color threshold is kind of removes some of the noise, so it's kind of how much contrast before it stops increasing these samples. So lowering it will increase your render times but give you a better result. So I'm going to increase this to 007. Indirect illumination for a final, you probably want to put up to at least high. In settings, this is some of the DMC sampler, again getting back to how this calculates and how many steps it takes in dividing the pixels before it stops calculating. So I'm going to increase the adaptive amount and decrease the noise threshold, which will help decrease the amount of noise, 0.06, and increase the samples to 12. I'm also going to increase the dynamic memory limit to 8 gigs here. This will depend on how much memory you have allocated on your machine. You generally don't want to go above whatever your machine can handle. So if you know your machine specs, if you don't, you may want to keep this maybe around 2 to 4. But I can increase this a bit higher. And so these are kind of my final output settings. One last thing is under render elements here, we can add some render passes. This will help later in doing some compositing. I didn't do any of the compositing on White Storm. We had additional people that I handed off all these files to. But if you have After Effects or some Nuke or whatever your compositing program of choice, you may want to play around with some of these render elements, or even in Photoshop, for doing just a still, bringing these render elements into Photoshop and making adjustments will give you a whole lot more control and can really bring an image from something that's looking good to something that's just, you know, will blow people away. So it can make a big difference. So I'm just going to quickly go over a few of the passes I generally will include. We'll do a diffuse, which will just be an overall color of the scene. A global illumination, if I'm using that GI. Luminance, I'll use, or not illuminance, self-illumination. I'll use if I have any sort of lights, like on a spaceship or in a room, any material that's self-illuminating, glowing, I'll use that. I don't have any in this shot. Let's see, we also want V-ray lighting, might as well. You don't always use that. We will want a reflection. And you'll use a refraction if you have any glass or transparent. We're not using any of that, so we don't need it. A shadows, total lighting, which is basically the GI. It's basically the GI plus the lighting pass combined. Sometimes I'll need that for things. And then also a Z depth. In all these, you can leave the default settings except for the Z depth we'll need to set, the min and the max, kind of like we did when making our brushes. So from here, I'll just, again, select the camera, or look here down at my XYZ axis, and you can see as I move here to the right, the Y increasing. So you can see it's about 3 meters to the camera from the origin. And then if I go the other way, it's about, say, 5.5 meters to the end. So that'll give us a total of about 8.5 meters from camera to the furthest distance. So we'll have this start, since the closest bit is maybe 0.5 meter away. I'm going to set this to 0.5 meter minimum. That'll cover this initial bit of ground that's showing up. And then go up to 8.5. I might give it a little bit more just to be on the safe side, so let's do 8.7 for the min and max there. Save this out. And I'm going to do a quick render here. I'm going to let it go. Actually, I'm just going to decrease this to half size just for this preview, just so it goes a little faster. And I may edit this and come back. So let me go ahead and, and also stop that. For the final output, if I'm going to be going into Photoshop, just so that I have an alpha channel, I'm going to switch to PNG. So let's call this Cave version 3. Save that as a PNG, so I'll have that alpha channel. And you'll see in the render pass, each of these will be called K version 3, and then whatever the pass is, diffuse filter, global illumination. And let me also grab this light and turn it on invisible, just so we're getting that transparency here. So I'm going to go ahead and render that, and I'll be back in a second when those passes are done so that I can show them to you. Okay, and I'm back. Let the render finish. I was having some problems with the PNG file format for some reason, so I ended up changing to a Targa, and just doing a Targa image with the alpha channel. But here we can see we've got our Z depth is looking really nice. Again, we don't have any pure whites. We are getting some pure blacks, so we may need to increase the far distance to, say, like 10 meters. We go here to the Z depth instead of this 8.7, maybe go to 10 or 12. So that would need to be fixed. Say 12. Here we can see our total lighting. So this is all the lighting. It looks very similar to the beauty pass. We've got our shadow pass. The shadows actually appear as white. So usually you'll want to invert this to be able to see the shadows. We've got our reflections, or basically our spec. And then the Vray lighting without global illumination. And then the global illumination by itself. And then our just color diffuse. Now, one thing I did notice while doing this render was that the bump we applied to the ground was really increasing the render time. Because we used a procedural texture on it. Procedural textures have an almost infinite resolution because of the way they're created. And so the sampling had all this information that it wanted to sample in order to get the final image, and it just kept going and going, and it increased the render time a lot. So if that's a problem, or if you want to try adjusting it, you can either remove this from the bump and that'll greatly increase your render time. You can always try changing the size or the bump smoothing, but also what might help is under here in Vray, the adaptive DMC image sampler is decreasing that. This should be 3. For our final render, we had it at 24. Decreasing that to 12 will end the number of samples it does sooner, and so it'll spend less time on this kind of noisy bump map we have here. So if that's a problem, those may be some settings to change. One other thing that I had mentioned before in some of the other videos that I forgot was bringing back in some of the rocks we used for our brush and putting them around the base of some of these rocks to kind of help that transition from these rocks to the ground. So I was just going to do that really quick. By going here to import and merge, we can find that rock scene. So here it is, the White Storm Cave rock brush. Open that, and we'll see we've just got the box and the camera, and the box was our rocks. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK. And we can see our rocks are pretty massive, so we just want to scale them down. Move these over. And kind of place these right at the base so you can see them just popping up through the floor. And let's go to our material and just apply the same rock blend to these rocks. And then we can just, again, Control V to duplicate, rotate this a bit in a different direction, position, and get some debris here around the base of our rocks. Scale this up so we have some larger pieces. And then, you know, we can also move these over to the other side and just place some of these larger debris pieces around and do a render again. So and if you ever want to add to the scene, you can always, you know, again, go back, do additional sculpts, you know, place them around the scene as you need. And you can always switch back here if we hide our high geo and unhide our low geo. You can use this as a quick way as reference for positioning some more rocks without having the high geo on. So that about wraps up everything I want to go over on this tutorial. I hope some of these tips have been very helpful and will improve your workflow. If you want to make sure to check out whitestormsaga.com, there'll be more information on this project that I used for this tutorial example on the site there. There should also be a link below the video. And you can find out more information on this and more information on what part I took in on that project. So thanks again for watching.